Baby found a starving German shepherd tied to a tree. What she did next left the town speechless. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a moment in time that will stay with you forever. A moment that tested the strength of a child, the loyalty of a dog, and the fragile line between tragedy and triumph. This isn't fiction. It happened. And it might just change the way you see the world. Like, share, and let us know where you're watching from, because this story deserves to be heard. In the quiet little town of Meadowbrook, where days passed slowly and evenings fell like soft blankets over rooftops, lived a girl named Emily. She was just 6 years old, small for her age, with a head full of golden curls and eyes that seemed to see more than others did. Emily wasn't loud like the other children on her street. She didn't chase after balls or scream with laughter on summer evenings. She preferred the company of shadows, of rustling leaves, and the soft hush of wind moving through trees. Behind Emily's modest white house was a thick line of woods, not wild enough to be dangerous, but dense enough to feel like a different world. To the adults, it was simply the backyard forest. To Emily, it was something far more sacred, a place of wonder where she could disappear into the arms of nature and become someone else entirely. Out there, the world didn't feel too big. It felt just right. She had her routine. Every evening after school, she'd pull on her red rain boots, even if the sun was shining, and slip out to wander beneath the canopy of branches. She'd walk slowly, tracing familiar paths, letting her fingers brush against the bark of old trees as though greeting old friends. Sometimes she hummed to herself. Other times she simply listened to the birds, the breeze, the creaking limbs that told stories only she could hear. It was on one such afternoon, a windier one than usual, that something changed. The trees were restless that day, swaying and groaning against each other like they were trying to warn the world of something. Emily had just crossed the small wooden log that served as a makeshift bridge over a shallow creek when she stopped. The wind had shifted, and with it came a sound. At first, she thought it was the wind itself, moaning low through the branches. But then she heard it again, thinner this time, sharper. A whimper. Not loud, not clear, but enough to make her pause. She tilted her head and narrowed her eyes. It wasn't the chirp of a bird or the rustle of an animal in the underbrush. It was something else. Something that sounded sad. The sound came again, soft and broken, like someone whispering from far away. A cry, maybe, or a plea. Most children might have run back toward the safety of home, to familiar voices and the scent of dinner on the stove. But not Emily. Curiosity bloomed in her chest like a fragile flower, and with a deep breath, she followed the sound. Her boots crunched over damp leaves as she stepped off her usual trail, deeper into the part of the woods where the trees stood closer together and the sunlight barely touched the ground. The further she went, the colder it seemed to get. A hush had fallen over the forest, as though it too was holding its breath. She walked slowly, carefully, guided only by instinct and the faint pull of that distant sound. The wind carried it to her in fragments. A soft whine, then silence, then another. Her heart thudded in her chest, not with fear, but with something else. A quiet urgency. The kind you feel when you know something is waiting. And then, just beyond a thick patch of blackberry bushes, she saw it. There, half hidden behind the twisted limbs of a fallen tree, lay a shape that didn't belong. Large, still, and strangely silent. Emily froze. Her breath caught. It was a dog. At least it used to be. He was lying on his side, ribs showing beneath matted fur, eyes half closed. A thick rope wrapped tightly around his neck, tied crudely to the base of a tree trunk. He wasn't barking. He wasn't growling. He wasn't doing much of anything, just lying there as though waiting for the end. Emily stood very still. The dog slowly opened one eye, then the other. Their gazes met for a long, silent moment. And in that moment, she didn't see a beast. She didn't see a stray. She saw something broken, something scared, something waiting. The wind tugged gently at her coat. She stepped closer, her small hands balled into fists at her sides. The dog didn't move. He didn't even flinch. There was no blood, but there was pain. She could see it in the way his body curled, in the stiffness of his limbs. Someone had tied him here. Someone had left him. She didn't speak. Not out loud. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the crust of bread she'd saved from lunch. Carefully, slowly, she placed it a few feet from his paws and stepped back. For a while, nothing happened. The wind blew. Leaves danced. The dog stared at the bread, then at her. Then, with a deep, strained breath, he inched forward and took a bite. Emily exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The dog chewed slowly, mechanically, like he wasn't sure if this was real. She sat down, not too close, but close enough. She didn't know what to do next. She only knew she couldn't leave yet. Not with him like this. So she sat, and the dog ate, and the wind whispered secrets between them. When the sun began to dip behind the trees and the air turned colder still, Emily finally stood. The dog looked up, eyes blinking slowly. She didn't speak. She just nodded as if to promise she'd return. Then, without another sound, she turned and walked home, boots dragging through the leaves, heart heavier than it had ever felt. She didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing for certain. The forest had whispered, and she had listened. The wind had settled by morning, but something inside Emily had not. Even as she brushed her teeth and tried to focus on her cereal, the image returned, again and again, like a shadow on the edge of her thoughts. The dog. Those dull, tired eyes. The bones that pressed through his thin fur. The way he chewed the piece of bread as though it were his last chance to taste kindness. She didn't speak a word of it to her parents. What could she say? That she'd wandered too deep into the forest and found a ghost of a dog tied to a tree like an afterthought? No, they wouldn't understand. Not yet. So she kept quiet, quietly slipping a slice of ham into her coat pocket before leaving for school and never letting the image leave her mind. All day, the world moved around her. Lessons were taught, lunch was served, children laughed and shouted in the playground. But Emily felt as though she was somewhere else entirely. Her mind remained in the woods, with the dog who hadn't barked, who hadn't begged. The one who had simply watched her, as if already halfway gone. As the final school bell rang and the sun began its slow descent, Emily rushed home, her little red boots thudding against the wooden floor of the porch as she dropped her school bag and disappeared out the back door before anyone could call her name. The woods welcomed her like an old friend. She moved faster this time, ducking under low branches and stepping around patches of tangled roots. She didn't hum today. She didn't look at the birds or the trees. Her heart beat faster the closer she got. And then she saw him, just where she had left him, though he had moved slightly, as though trying to find a more comfortable position. The rope had allowed him barely a few feet of movement, and he had used it to drag himself into a patch of dappled sunlight that barely warmed the ground. His eyes were half closed, his chest rising and falling in slow, heavy breaths. Emily stopped a few feet away and watched. The dog didn't lift his head. She knelt down slowly and pulled the slice of ham from her coat pocket. It was still cold. She tore it into pieces and laid them on the same flat stone as yesterday, inching it closer than before. Only then did the dog stir. He turned his head slightly, eyes blinking with effort. His nose twitched. Slowly, painfully slowly, he lifted his front paw and dragged himself forward. Every movement looked like it cost him something. But he moved, inch by inch, until his muzzle reached the food and he began to eat. There was no greed in the way he ate. No excitement. Just quiet need. like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be full or safe. Emily watched in silence. Her hands rested in her lap, her fingers curled inward. She wanted to reach out, to touch his fur, but she stayed still. She sensed it wasn't time yet. Trust was a slow thing, and this dog had clearly learned to be cautious. Her eyes drifted to the rope. It was thick and coarse, tied tightly around the trunk of a narrow tree. The bark was worn where he had clearly tried to pull free once, maybe many times. But he had given up. There were angry red marks on his neck where the rope had dug in. Some spots looked raw. She swallowed hard. Who would do this? The question echoed in her mind, unanswered. A squirrel darted nearby, startling her slightly. The dog looked up, ears twitching, but didn't move otherwise. Emily looked back into his eyes. They were amber-brown, dulled by pain but still watching, still aware. "I'll come back," she whispered, more to herself than to him. And she meant it. She sat with him until the light began to fade and the sky shifted to a cool gray. The woods grew quiet again, and a chill settled into the earth. She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees, and glanced one last time at the figure curled at the base of the tree. His eyes followed her. There was no bark, no whine, just a look. A long, still look that said more than words ever could. She turned and left, her boots crunching over leaves and twigs as she made her way home. The forest was darker now, and the wind had returned, rustling through the trees like whispers on the edge of hearing. Emily didn't look back. But in her heart, she carried the weight of what she'd seen and the quiet, starving soul still waiting beneath the trees. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she made a promise to herself. Tomorrow, she would come back with more food. A blanket. Something sharp for the rope. She didn't know exactly what, but she knew one thing for certain. That dog had been left behind. Forgotten. But not anymore. The evening sky outside Emily's window deepened into a pale violet, the stars just beginning to blink open above the quiet rooftops of Meadowbrook. Inside the little blue house, the air smelled faintly of tomato soup and buttered toast. Her parents moved about the kitchen, their voices low and calm, as the television murmured in the background. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary night. But not for Emily. She sat at the dinner table, legs swinging beneath the chair, eyes fixed on the bowl in front of her. Her spoon lay untouched. She hadn't said much since she came home. She answered questions with nods and shrugs, but her mind had never left the forest. It stayed curled beneath that tree, wrapped around a starving body and a silent stare that had etched itself deep into her heart. Later, when her mother tucked her in and kissed her forehead, Emily closed her eyes and pretended to drift off, her breathing slow and steady. But sleep was the farthest thing from her mind. The weight of the day pressed into her chest, heavy and urgent. She waited. Minutes passed. Then more. The hum of voices downstairs faded, replaced by the soft ticking of the hallway clock and the sighing groans of the old house settling into the night. When she was certain they were asleep, Emily slowly sat up. She slipped from bed, careful not to creak the floorboards, and crept to the closet where her flashlight was hidden behind a stack of board games. From the laundry basket, she pulled an old flannel blanket, one she'd used during summer picnics. It smelled faintly of grass and sunshine. She opened her window slowly, just enough to squeeze through, and dropped down into the yard with a soft thud. The cold air wrapped around her like a second skin, but she didn't shiver. She was focused now. Determined. The woods looked different at night. The trees leaned in closer. The shadows stretched longer. Every rustle felt like a secret being whispered. But Emily wasn't afraid. She walked quickly, holding the flashlight low, casting a narrow beam that danced over roots and fallen leaves. The deeper she went, the faster her heart began to beat. Not with fear, but hope. Would he still be there? Had someone come and taken him away? Had he given up? She turned the final bend in the trail, stepped past the bramble she now knew by memory, and stopped. He was there, still lying beneath the same tree, still bound by the same fraying rope, still silent. But this time, he lifted his head when he saw her. Just slightly, just enough to let her know he remembered. Emily approached slowly, just as she had before. She crouched a few feet away and set down the flashlight, letting it spill a soft yellow glow over the clearing. Then she unfolded the blanket and laid it on the ground beside him, smoothing it out gently with her hands. "I brought this for you," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "It's soft." The dog watched her, eyes following every motion. He didn't move away. He didn't growl. He simply breathed, long and slow. She pulled a small granola bar from her coat and unwrapped it quietly, breaking off a piece and placing it near his paws. He sniffed it cautiously before chewing it, slower than before, but with a little more strength. Emily sat back on her heels, watching him with wide, steady eyes. For a long while, neither of them moved. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. Then, something changed. Very slowly, Emily leaned forward and extended one hand. Not to his head, not to his face, just to his paw, the one stretched out near the edge of the blanket. Her fingers hovered there, trembling slightly, before they touched the dirty fur. The dog didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He didn't even blink. Instead, he wagged his tail. It was faint, barely more than a twitch. But it happened. Emily's breath caught. A warmth bloomed in her chest and crept up to her eyes. She smiled, her throat tight, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. It wasn't sadness. Not entirely. It was something deeper. The kind of feeling that doesn't have a proper name, only a knowing. He trusted her. In that small, fragile moment, something invisible passed between them. A silent agreement. A promise. Emily gently rested her palm on his paw and sat there until the stars above grew brighter and the night wrapped itself around them like a secret. Eventually, she stood, wiping her face with the sleeve of her jacket. She didn't want to go, but she had to. Her parents would wake soon. She couldn't risk being caught. Not yet. Before she left, she whispered, "I'll come back. Tomorrow." And as she turned to go, flashlight in hand, the dog laid his head on the blanket she had brought him. His eyes followed her until she disappeared into the trees. The morning after Emily touched the dog's paw, the world felt just a little bit different. The sun peeked through her curtains as it always did, and the same scent of toast drifted up from the kitchen, but her chest carried a strange new weight. Not a burden, but a kind of responsibility. Something had shifted, as if the forest had placed a quiet secret into her hands and trusted her to carry it. All day at school, she could barely focus. Her pencil scratched lazily across her paper while the teacher spoke about numbers and spelling, but Emily's thoughts stayed with the dog. His eyes, his stillness, the twitch of his tail when she touched him. Most of all, she thought of the rope, tight, painful, cruel, and how it didn't belong on something so quiet, so defeated. She had made a decision the night before, long after she had returned to bed and stared at the ceiling in the dark. She would bring him home. Not inside the house. She wasn't ready for that. Her parents would never allow it. But she had a place. A secret place. Her little wooden playhouse tucked away in the back corner of their yard, half hidden by tall hedges and overgrown bushes. It had once been bright yellow, with flower boxes under the windows and a small white door with her name painted above it. But that was years ago. The paint had faded now, and the flowers had long since wilted. Still, it stood strong, forgotten by everyone but Emily. That evening, when dinner was done and the sun was sinking low, Emily quietly gathered supplies. A pair of dull scissors from the kitchen drawer. a box of baby wipes from the bathroom cabinet, an old dog bowl from the garage, a leftover from when they had briefly owned a puppy that hadn't stayed long. She slipped them into her backpack along with a small towel and a plastic container filled with leftover chicken from dinner. Once again, she waited until her parents had gone to bed. Then, beneath the soft blanket of night, she crept through the backyard and slipped back into the woods. The dog was waiting. He lifted his head when he saw her, a little faster this time. His ears twitched. His eyes followed her every move. Emily knelt beside him, setting the flashlight down to cast its gentle glow across the ground. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out the scissors and reached toward the rope. It was harder than she expected, thick and knotted tight. But after several minutes of sawing and shifting, she managed to cut through it. The rope fell. The dog didn't move at first. He just stared at her, as if unsure whether he could trust the freedom. "It's okay now," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You can come with me." He stood slowly, muscles stiff, legs unsteady. But he followed. She walked carefully through the dark trees, pausing every few feet to make sure he was behind her. His paws were silent on the forest floor, and his shape moved like a shadow, quiet, cautious, barely there. She guided him through the tall hedges and into the backyard, toward the small, forgotten playhouse. She opened the creaky little door and stepped aside, letting him pass. He hesitated at first, sniffed the air, and then stepped inside. Emily followed, closing the door behind them. Inside, the air was cool and musty. The floor was scattered with old pillows and coloring books from years ago. She laid the towel down and placed the chicken pieces in the bowl. He ate in silence, slower now, less desperately. When he finished, she knelt beside him and began cleaning his wounds with gentle hands. The baby wipes were cold, and the smell was sharp, but he didn't pull away. He simply watched her, as if trying to understand why she was doing this. She worked quietly, wiping the dirt from his fur, examining the red marks on his neck, cleaning the dried blood around one of his paws. It was the first time she saw him not as the sad creature from the woods, but as something healing, slowly returning to life. When she finished, she sat back against the wall and studied him. "You need a name," she whispered. "I can't keep calling you just dog." She thought for a moment, watching the way he blended into the dimness of the playhouse, barely visible in the shadows. "Shadow," she said softly. "That's what you are. Quiet and always there." The dog blinked slowly. Then, with a soft grunt, he lay down beside her, resting his head on the towel. Emily smiled. For the next few days, a new rhythm began. Every morning, she woke up early, before the birds, before the sun, and tiptoed outside with food in hand. She would sit beside Shadow in the playhouse, sometimes feeding him, sometimes brushing bits of dirt from his fur, sometimes just sitting in silence while he lay at her feet. She didn't talk to her parents about him. Not yet. It felt too delicate, too sacred, like a bubble that would burst if touched too soon. And every evening after school, she would return to him. She brought small things, a sock filled with rice to keep him warm, an old stuffed rabbit she thought he might like. She read him stories from her picture books, pointing to the drawings and whispering the words like secrets only they shared. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't whine. But each day, his eyes grew a little brighter. His movements became less stiff. He began to wag his tail when he saw her, just a little, but enough. They were both quiet souls, finding in each other what the world hadn't given them, understanding without words, comfort without conditions. There was a secret, but it was also the beginning of something that neither of them had known they needed. Emily had rescued him from the woods. But it was Shadow who was saving her in return. At first, it was small things. A few slices of turkey missing from the fridge. The lid of the peanut butter jar not screwed on all the way. An extra granola bar gone from the cupboard. Emily's mother didn't think much of it. Children forget, snack without asking, or feed the occasional squirrel in the yard. It wasn't unusual. But then there was the muddy towel she found under the laundry sink, the faint trail of grass on Emily's bedroom carpet, and most of all, the way Emily had started waking up before the alarm. She had always been a sleepy child, hard to rouse for school, slow to move in the mornings. But now, her bed was empty when her mother came in. The girl would be dressed, shoes on, hair roughly brushed, claiming she had just wanted to watch the birds. A mother knows when something has changed. It's not in the words, but in the spaces between them, in the hush, the glance, the too careful explanations. And so, like any mother following the quiet trail of instinct, she started paying closer attention. One evening, just as the sun began to dip and the air turned that certain shade of gold that makes everything feel like a dream, she stood by the kitchen window and watched her daughter from behind the curtain. Emily crept across the backyard, hugging something close to her chest, a folded towel, a small container, something cradled in both hands. She moved slowly, deliberately, toward the hedges that lined the far corner of the yard, near the old playhouse that hadn't been opened in years. Her mother didn't say a word. She waited. And then, after a long few minutes, she quietly slipped on her shoes, left the screen door open just enough to pass through, and followed. The grass was cool underfoot, and the breeze carried the soft scent of pine and soil. As she neared the hedges, she heard something, not a voice, not a shout, but soft murmuring. Emily was talking, her words low and gentle, like the way one speaks to a sleeping baby. Her mother parted the bushes slowly and peeked through. What she saw made her freeze. There, nestled inside the dim interior of the playhouse, lay a large German shepherd. His fur was still patchy and dull, his ribs faintly visible, but there was a blanket beneath him, a small bowl beside him, and a girl at his side. Emily was sitting cross-legged, wiping at his paw with a damp cloth, her forehead creased with the kind of care that came from something deeper than kindness. The dog didn't resist. He lay still, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, completely at peace. For a moment, her mother didn't know what to feel. Fear? Shock? Anger? This wasn't just a stray in the yard. It was a large, powerful animal her daughter had somehow brought from the woods and kept hidden. Anything could have happened. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and yet, there was no tension in the space between them. No threat in the dog's body. Only stillness. Only trust. Then Emily looked up. She froze when she saw her mother standing there in the narrow doorway. Her eyes went wide, and her hands trembled, the cloth dropping into her lap. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, voice shaking. "Please don't be mad. Please don't take him away." Her mother stepped inside slowly, her gaze fixed on the animal. The dog lifted his head just enough to see her. He didn't growl. He didn't move. Instead, he lowered his head again and let out a low, exhausted breath, as if telling her he was tired of being feared. Emily moved closer to him protectively. "I named him Shadow," she said. "I found him in the woods. He was tied to a tree. I think someone left him there to die." The words hung in the air, heavy and real. Her mother didn't respond at first. She knelt beside them, slowly, cautiously, her eyes scanning the dog's body, the healing scabs, the rope burns, the hunger still clinging to his bones. And then she met his eyes. They weren't wild eyes. They weren't dangerous. They were old, tired, and quiet, the eyes of something that had suffered too long and yet still hoped, somehow, for softness. Shadow blinked at her, then gently lowered his head to the blanket again. Emily's hand found her mother's arm. "He's good," she whispered. "He's just sad. I didn't want him to be alone anymore." For a long moment, the only sound in the playhouse was the wind passing through the wooden slats and the quiet rhythm of Shadow's breathing. Then, finally, her mother sighed. It wasn't a sigh of frustration. It was something else, like the slow unraveling of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "We can't keep him here like this," she said gently. "He needs real care. He needs to see a vet. And we need to know who he belongs to." Emily's face tensed. But what if he belongs to someone bad? What if they tied him up on purpose? Her mother looked down at the dog again. He hadn't moved. He was trusting her, a stranger, simply because Emily had trusted her first. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we'll find out. And we'll make sure he's safe." Emily looked down at Shadow, her small hand brushing over his back. "He's already safe," she whispered. "He's with me." Her mother smiled softly and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Then let's help him together." And for the first time since she had found him, Emily felt the burden lift, not because it had disappeared, but because someone was now carrying it with her. Shadow didn't move, but his tail gave a quiet, slow wag. Not much, but just enough. The next morning arrived with the kind of softness that only follows the storm of a secret being shared. Emily awoke with a tight knot of nervousness in her stomach. The playhouse was no longer just hers and Shadow's hidden world. Now her mother knew, and what came next felt uncertain. Still, as sunlight poured in through the cracks in the blinds, Emily moved with quiet purpose. Something was happening. Something real. Downstairs, her mother was already dressed, her keys in one hand and her expression unreadable. There was no lecture, no punishment, only a gentle nod toward the back door and a folded blanket in her arms. "Let's bring him to the vet," she said softly. "We'll figure things out from there." Emily nodded, clutching the corner of her jacket tightly as she followed. Shadow was lying just outside the playhouse when they arrived, his head resting on the dirt as if he'd been waiting for her. His ears perked slightly when he saw them approach, and then slowly relaxed again when he saw it was her and her mother together. He didn't protest as they laid the blanket down and gently coaxed him onto it. He was still weak, his legs unsteady, but he moved with surprising trust. Emily sat beside him in the car, one hand resting on his back, the other wrapped tightly around the sleeve of her mother's coat. No one spoke much during the ride. The hum of the engine and the occasional shuffle from the blanket were the only sounds. The vet's office stood at the edge of town, a small brick building with ivy climbing up one side and a wind chime that danced with every breeze. As they carried Shadow through the door, the receptionist, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, looked up from her desk and blinked. Her smile faltered for just a moment as her gaze fell on the dog's thin body and rope-worn neck. "We found him in the woods," Emily said, before her mother could speak. Her voice was steady, stronger than it had been in days. "Someone left him there." The woman nodded and picked up the phone. "Let's get Dr. Rowan," she said gently. "Right away." They were led into a quiet room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something warm and clean. Shadow lay on a padded table, his breathing slow, his gaze tracking every movement in the room but never once flinching. Dr. Rowan entered moments later, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, sleeves rolled up, and a quiet, calm energy that seemed to fill the space like sunlight. He examined Shadow carefully, checking his heartbeat, brushing over his fur with gloved hands, and lifting his limbs to check for injury. As he reached for the scanner to check for a microchip, Emily held her breath. A soft beep. "There's a chip," Dr. Rowan said, surprise flickering in his voice. "Older model. Let's see what we can find." He typed the information into a computer. Emily leaned forward, her hands clenched in her lap. A name appeared on the screen, then an address, then nothing. "No phone number," the vet murmured. "This registration is over 8 years old. Last listed owner lived out of state. No recent updates. That trail's gone cold." Emily looked at her mother, uncertainty creeping back into her chest. "What does that mean?" "It means," her mother said quietly, "that he might have had a home once. A long time ago. But now." "He doesn't," Emily finished for her. "Not anymore." Dr. Rowan looked at them both, then at Shadow, who had laid his head on the exam table as if it were a pillow. "He's underweight, dehydrated. He's got some minor infections, and clearly he's been neglected. But with proper care, food, rest, he'll recover. It'll take time, but he'll be okay." Something inside Emily loosened, like a knot unraveling. "I want to help," she said, and she meant it. For the next hour, they worked together, Emily, her mother, and the staff, gently cleaning Shadow's wounds, trimming the overgrown fur around his legs, brushing away weeks of dirt and dried blood. Shadow didn't resist. He let it happen, even leaned into the brush at times, as if he remembered the feeling from long ago but had forgotten how it felt to receive it. Emily was especially careful around the old rope burn on his neck. She dabbed it softly with a warm cloth, whispering to him all the while. Nonsense words. Little stories. Anything to let him know he wasn't alone. And the strangest thing happened. As she worked, Shadow began to look different. Not physically, he was still thin, still limping, still tired, but in his eyes, where once there had been only silence and survival, now there was something else. A quiet, fragile hope that flickered like the flame of a candle not yet sure it was safe to burn. When they returned home, the vet having agreed to let them keep Shadow on a temporary basis while they figured things out, Emily helped her mother set up a small sleeping space in the laundry room. There was a blanket, a pillow, a bowl of water, and a line of kibble arranged in a neat curve beside it. Emily placed Shadow's name, written in marker on a piece of cardboard, beside the bowl. He sniffed the space, circled slowly, and lay down with a sigh that sounded almost human. Later that night, long after the house had gone quiet, Emily crept downstairs and sat beside him in the dim light of the hallway. She didn't say much, just reached out, ran her fingers through the now softened fur, and listened to the steady rhythm of his breath. He was safe, and for the first time since she had found him, he seemed to believe it too. The days that followed passed like the slow turning of pages in a worn and beloved book. The kind where you already know the ending, but every sentence still matters. Shadow was healing, not just in body, but in spirit. His steps grew steadier, his tail began to wag more freely, and his eyes, once dull and distant, now followed Emily with a quiet alertness that looked a lot like trust. The vet visits became routine. Emily always came along, sitting beside him in the back seat, her small hand resting on his shoulder during the ride. Shadow would lean against her gently, not out of need, but choice, a silent comfort in her nearness. One crisp morning, as golden leaves began to fall from the trees like whispered reminders of change, Dr. Rowan invited Emily and her mother into his back office after Shadow's checkup. It was a small, cluttered room, filled with books, files, and the warm smell of coffee. On his desk sat a folder, one he had been quietly putting together since Shadow first arrived. He looked at Emily, then at her mother, and then at the dog who now lay peacefully at Emily's feet. "Some scars," he began, "aren't from accidents. They tell stories." Emily listened, her fingers gently stroking Shadow's ear as the vet opened the file. "I've seen these kinds of marks before. Not the surface wounds, those can come from anywhere, but the specific placement of them. His hind legs, his front shoulders, the wear on his teeth, and the pressure lines around his neck and chest. It all suggests something more structured than neglect." He paused, letting the words settle. "I believe Shadow was once part of a working dog program, likely police, possibly military." Emily looked up slowly. Her mother's brow furrowed. "You mean he was trained?" her mother asked. Yes, Dr. Rowan nodded. And trained well. These dogs go through rigorous routines, controlled environments, repetitive commands, physical tasks. They're intelligent, disciplined, loyal to a fault. But they're also pushed hard. And when something happens, if they get injured, fail a task, or simply grow too old, sometimes they're discarded, especially in older systems that didn't treat animals the way we expect now. Emily's heart tightened. She looked at Shadow differently now, not as just a dog who had been hurt, but as a dog who had once belonged to something bigger. A job, a team, a mission. He had worn loyalty like a badge and had likely given everything he had, only to be left behind when he wasn't useful anymore. It explained so much. The obedience in his silence. The way he flinched at sudden movements. How he never barked but always watched, always waited. He had learned to be invisible, to serve without question. And when he no longer could, they had tied him to a tree and walked away. That night, Emily didn't sleep right away. She lay in bed with her sketchpad open, a pencil dancing lightly across the paper in the quiet glow of her nightlight. Her thoughts swirled with images, some from her imagination, some pulled from pieces of what the vet had said. She drew Shadow as he might have once been, strong, alert, wearing a vest with a badge stitched onto it. She imagined him running across wide training fields, his muscles lean and ready, his eyes sharp and full of purpose. She drew handlers beside him, faceless men with radios and stern expressions, and Shadow bounding forward to fetch something, to rescue someone, to do what he had been told. She turned the page. Now she drew the forest, the tree, the rope. She didn't draw the person who had tied it. She couldn't. Instead, she shaded the darkness around the tree thicker, heavier, as if the weight of betrayal itself had taken form. Then she turned the page once more and began something new. Shadow running through an open field, no vest on his back, no commands barking into his ears. Just sky above and earth beneath. Emily drawn beside him, laughing, barefoot, her arms outstretched as if she, too, had finally been let free. She didn't finish the drawing. Not that night. But she kept it close. And as she drifted off to sleep, she thought not just of who Shadow had been, but of who he was becoming. Someone more than a job, more than a task, more than a forgotten soldier of silence. He was hers now. Not because she had claimed him, but because he had chosen to stay. The week started like any other at Maplewood Elementary. The bell rang, backpacks were zipped open with tired hands, and the classroom air filled with the soft clatter of pencils, erasers, and quiet chatter. But something felt different this Monday. Maybe it was the paper banner stretching across the hallway that read, "Kindness Week," in bright bubble letters. Or maybe it was just that the air itself seemed warmer, like the school had decided to breathe a little slower, a little softer. For Emily, kindness had already taken root in her life. It wasn't a theme to be explored for just a few days. It was something she now carried like a second skin. Ever since she had found Shadow and brought him into her world, her heart had changed. It had grown heavier in places, yes, but also gentler. She saw things differently now, not just people, but silence, pain, and small moments that passed unnoticed by others. When her teacher, Miss Adams, asked the class to bring something meaningful to share for Kindness Week, Emily didn't hesitate. She carefully selected 3 drawings from her sketchpad, one of Shadow lying beneath the tree where she had first found him, another of him resting on a blanket beside her in the playhouse, and the third, her favorite, of them running freely through a field, untethered by ropes or pasts. She mounted them on a piece of cardboard and carried them to school in her arms like precious cargo. Miss Adams helped her pin them up on the classroom board, right in the center where everyone could see. At first, no one said much. But then the questions began, softly, curiously. Who is he? Did you really find him? Is that a real story? Emily, who was usually shy, found herself speaking. Not loudly, not with flair, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen something sacred and was ready to share it. She told them about the dog in the woods, about the rope, the silence, the healing. She didn't use big words. She didn't need to. The story lived in her voice, and the classroom grew still as she spoke. By recess, the story had spread. By lunch, it had traveled to other grades. By the end of the day, there was a row of sticky notes beneath her drawings, messages from students in shaky handwriting. "Shadow is so brave. Thank you for saving him. I would have helped too." Emily read each one carefully. And Shadow, though he couldn't read, would have understood every word if he had seen them, because kindness, once given, has a way of echoing beyond what we can measure. That evening, Miss Adams called Emily's mother with an idea. "We'd like to invite Shadow to school," she said, "just for a short visit. Nothing stressful. The kids would love it. I think it might help him too." Emily's mother hesitated. Shadow was doing better, yes. He ate more, moved with less pain, even napped with his head on Emily's lap sometimes. But he still flinched at certain sounds. The vacuum, distant sirens, even loud laughter. "He's not ready," she started to say, but Emily touched her arm. "I think he is," she whispered, "and I'll stay with him the whole time." So they agreed. The next day, Shadow would visit the school. That morning was different from the others. Emily woke up early and brushed Shadow's coat with a soft bristle brush. She cleaned around his eyes, whispered words of encouragement as he leaned into her touch. Her mother packed a small water bowl, treats, and a folded towel. And when the time came, Shadow walked to the car without a leash, just beside them, quietly, like he understood something important was about to happen. At school, a group of students waited at the front steps, holding hand-drawn signs that said, "Welcome, Shadow," and "You're safe here." Emily led him through the entrance slowly, step by step. He moved carefully, ears twitching, eyes scanning. His paws clicked gently against the tile floor. A few kids clapped, and Shadow flinched. Emily dropped to one knee and placed her hand on his chest. "It's okay," she whispered, looking into his eyes. "They're happy. That's all." And Shadow stayed. He didn't bolt. He didn't hide. He stayed. Inside the classroom, the students formed a wide, respectful circle on the carpet. Miss Adams sat cross-legged in the back, letting Emily take the lead. "This is Shadow," Emily said quietly, standing in the center. "He used to be scared, but he's learning that not everyone will hurt him." She looked down. Shadow looked up. Then something small and wonderful happened. One of the students, a boy with freckles and a nervous smile, stepped forward and held out his hand. Shadow sniffed it and licked it. A second child followed. Then a third. Small hands reached out slowly, gently, brushing over his back, his head, his ears. Shadow blinked, shifted his paws slightly, and then, for the first time in front of so many people, he wagged his tail. Emily smiled. Not a wide, triumphant grin, but something deeper. A slow, quiet joy that started in her chest and rose like warmth into her face. He was okay. And so was she. By the end of the visit, Shadow was lying peacefully among a small cluster of children, his head resting on someone's shoe, eyes half closed, utterly calm. Emily sat nearby, sketchpad in hand, drawing the moment as it unfolded, not with perfect lines or proportions, but with feeling. Later, as they walked home, Shadow didn't seem tired. He seemed lighter, as though some weight had shifted just enough for him to walk taller. Beside him, Emily carried more than her backpack. She carried the knowledge that kindness, once shared, didn't stop. It grew. That day, Shadow wasn't just a rescue story. He was a teacher. And the town, once asleep to small sadnesses, was beginning, slowly, beautifully, to awaken. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind that felt like a sigh, soft wind brushing through the trees, the sun spilling gold across the porch, and birds chirping like background music to an otherwise ordinary day. Inside the house, the scent of fresh laundry drifted through the open windows, and Emily was on the living room floor drawing again. Shadow curled nearby, his head resting on her foot like a silent promise. Everything felt calm, settled. For the first time since that moment in the woods, life had begun to make sense again. And then a sound broke the stillness. It was the slow crunch of gravel, tires pulling up onto the edge of the driveway. Not the sound of delivery trucks or neighbors' cars. No, this had a weight to it, a deliberate, heavy presence. Shadow lifted his head before Emily did. His ears perked, his body tensed. Something deep within him responded before any words had been spoken. Emily looked up and moved to the window, curious. An old, dust-covered pickup truck sat at the edge of their property, engine idling softly, the metal creaking as the driver's door opened. Out stepped a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was partly hidden, but his posture was confident, almost entitled. He walked slowly toward the porch, hands in his pockets. And with every step he took, Shadow's body grew stiffer. Then, for the first time since Emily had known him, he growled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was low and rough, a sound that seemed to rumble from a place older than fear, a sound born of memory. Emily froze. Shadow stood, his body positioned instinctively between her and the door, eyes locked on the figure approaching. Emily's mother, hearing the gravel and now the growl, stepped quickly from the kitchen and joined them at the window. She watched for a moment, then opened the front door just enough to step outside and meet the man halfway down the porch steps. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice firm but polite. The man looked up from beneath his cap. His eyes were pale, unreadable. He glanced past her, into the house, spotting Shadow through the open door. "That's my dog," he said plainly. "Got lost a few months back. Been looking for him ever since." Emily's heart stopped. She didn't understand the feeling exactly, only that it was cold and sinking, as if the floor beneath her had suddenly cracked. Her mother didn't speak right away. "What's his name?" she asked. The man shrugged. "Doesn't really matter now, does it? He knows me. That's what counts." Inside, Shadow hadn't moved, but his growl continued, deeper now, his legs braced, tail rigid. Emily had never seen him like this. She edged closer to him, slipping behind his body, her small hand reaching for his fur. He didn't even glance back at her. He was too focused. "I'm sorry," her mother said, keeping her tone calm. "But unless you have some proof of ownership, I can't just hand him over." The man sighed, long and slow. "He's chipped, isn't he? That chip says he's mine. I already reported him missing months ago. Check the records." Emily could see her mother tense, just slightly. The vet said the chip was outdated. No phone number, no current address. No contact made after registration. If you've been looking for him, why haven't you updated your information? The man didn't answer. His jaw clenched. He glanced again toward the doorway, this time longer, lingering. And Shadow took a step forward. Not aggressively, not in threat, but in challenge. His eyes never left the man's. There was no recognition in them, no spark of reunion, no relief. Only something harder to name. Something colder. A look that said, "I remember." But not fondly. The man held his stare for a moment, then finally stepped back, one hand lifting as if to signal he wasn't going to push. "Look, I'll be back. With paperwork. I've got rights." Without waiting for a reply, he turned, walked to his truck, and drove away. The gravel crackled beneath the tires, and then he was gone, leaving behind silence that didn't feel like peace. Emily looked up at her mother with wide, frightened eyes. Is he going to take Shadow away? Her mother shook her head slowly, pulling Emily into her arms. Not without proof. Not without going through the right process. But Emily didn't feel reassured. She turned her gaze toward Shadow, who was still standing by the door, staring at the spot where the truck had disappeared. His chest rose and fell heavily, his growl finally faded, but his body hadn't fully relaxed. She stepped toward him and laid her hand on his shoulder. He looked at her then, and something passed between them. Not fear, not confusion. Recognition. Not of the man, but of the feeling that came with him. Emily knelt beside him, resting her cheek against his side. "We won't let him take you," she whispered. "You're not going back." And somewhere deep inside, Shadow understood. Because that growl, that single quiet line drawn in the air, had not been fear. It had been refusal. A refusal to return to where pain lived. A refusal to forget the rope, the tree, the silence. He had found something else now. Something better. And even if the world tried to pull him back, even if papers and old names came knocking, Shadow was no longer lost. He was home. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind that felt like a sigh, soft wind brushing through the trees, the sun spilling gold across the porch, and birds chirping like background music to an otherwise ordinary day. Inside the house, the scent of fresh laundry drifted through the open windows, and Emily was on the living room floor drawing again. Shadow curled nearby, his head resting on her foot like a silent promise. Everything felt calm. Settled. For the first time since that moment in the woods, life had begun to make sense again. And then a sound broke the stillness. It was the slow crunch of gravel, tires pulling up onto the edge of the driveway. Not the sound of delivery trucks or neighbors' cars. No, this had a weight to it. A deliberate, heavy presence. Shadow lifted his head before Emily did. His ears perked, his body tensed. Something deep within him responded before any words had been spoken. Emily looked up and moved to the window, curious. An old, dust-covered pickup truck sat at the edge of their property, engine idling softly, the metal creaking as the driver's door opened. Out stepped a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was partly hidden, but his posture was confident, almost entitled. He walked slowly toward the porch, hands in his pockets. And with every step he took, Shadow's body grew stiffer. Then, for the first time since Emily had known him, he growled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was low and rough, a sound that seemed to rumble from a place older than fear, a sound born of memory. Emily froze. Shadow stood, his body positioned instinctively between her and the door, eyes locked on the figure approaching. Emily's mother, hearing the gravel and now the growl, stepped quickly from the kitchen and joined them at the window. She watched for a moment, then opened the front door just enough to step outside and meet the man halfway down the porch steps. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice firm but polite. The man looked up from beneath his cap. His eyes were pale, unreadable. He glanced past her, into the house, spotting Shadow through the open door. "That's my dog," he said plainly. "Got lost a few months back. Been looking for him ever since." Emily's heart stopped. She didn't understand the feeling exactly, only that it was cold and sinking, as if the floor beneath her had suddenly cracked. Her mother didn't speak right away. "What's his name?" she asked. The man shrugged. "Doesn't really matter now, does it? He knows me. That's what counts." Inside, Shadow hadn't moved. But his growl continued, deeper now, his legs braced, tail rigid. Emily had never seen him like this. She edged closer to him, slipping behind his body, her small hand reaching for his fur. He didn't even glance back at her. He was too focused. "I'm sorry," her mother said, keeping her tone calm. "But unless you have some proof of ownership, I can't just hand him over." The man sighed, long and slow. "He's chipped, isn't he? That chip says he's mine. I already reported him missing months ago. Check the records." Emily could see her mother tense, just slightly. The vet said the chip was outdated. No phone number, no current address. No contact made after registration. If you've been looking for him, why haven't you updated your information? The man didn't answer. His jaw clenched. He glanced again toward the doorway, this time longer, lingering. And Shadow took a step forward. Not aggressively, not in threat, but in challenge. His eyes never left the man's. There was no recognition in them, no spark of reunion, no relief. Only something harder to name. Something colder. A look that said, "I remember." But not fondly. The man held his stare for a moment, then finally stepped back, one hand lifting as if to signal he wasn't going to push. "Look, I'll be back. With paperwork. I've got rights." Without waiting for a reply, he turned, walked to his truck, and drove away. The gravel crackled beneath the tires, and then he was gone, leaving behind silence that didn't feel like peace. Emily looked up at her mother with wide, frightened eyes. "Is he going to take Shadow away?" Her mother shook her head slowly, pulling Emily into her arms. Not without proof. Not without going through the right process. But Emily didn't feel reassured. She turned her gaze toward Shadow, who was still standing by the door, staring at the spot where the truck had disappeared. His chest rose and fell heavily, his growl finally faded, but his body hadn't fully relaxed. She stepped toward him and laid her hand on his shoulder. He looked at her then, and something passed between them. Not fear, not confusion. Recognition. Not of the man, but of the feeling that came with him. Emily knelt beside him, resting her cheek against his side. "We won't let him take you," she whispered. "You're not going back." And somewhere deep inside, Shadow understood. Because that growl, that single quiet line drawn in the air, had not been fear. It had been refusal. A refusal to return to where pain lived. A refusal to forget the rope, the tree, the silence. He had found something else now. Something better. And even if the world tried to pull him back, even if papers and old names came knocking, Shadow was no longer lost. He was home. In the quiet corners of his mind, the world was not the soft haven of flannel blankets and gentle hands. It was sharp, sudden, and loud, filled with commands barked like thunder, boots that stomped without pause, and collars that tightened with every mistake. Shadow didn't have a name back then. Not one spoken with affection. He had a tag, a number, a call sign. A tool, not a soul. He remembered the training yard, the endless gravel beneath his paws, the scent of sweat and metal in the air. The bite sleeves. The drills. The way he learned not to flinch at gunfire, to hold still when the world around him erupted. Praise came in shouts, not softness. Rewards were thrown, not given. Love wasn't part of the job, but he did it, because that's what he was made for. Service. Obedience. Usefulness. His body became strong, his instincts sharp. He ran faster than the wind, leapt over fences like breath, tracked scent trails for miles. He found missing children once. He remembered their smell, fear, dirt, candy on breath. That mission had ended in cheering, clapping, a pat on the head. For a moment he had felt proud. And then it changed. He wasn't sure when. Maybe when his leg got injured during a jump. Maybe when he failed to attack fast enough during a simulation. Maybe when he just got old enough to be considered replaceable. He remembered the tone first. Voices colder, patience shorter. The leash tugged harder. the meal smaller, and then came the truck ride. The memory was blurry, like fog wrapped around pain. The back of the truck had smelled of gas and rust. The man, the one who claimed him now, hadn't spoken much. Just driven into the woods, engine humming a tired song. When the truck stopped, Shadow had wagged his tail, unsure but hopeful. Perhaps this was a break, a new task, maybe even a game. But there had been no game, only rope and silence. The tree was rough. The bark scratched his side. The rope was tight, too tight, and the collar pressed into his throat as he pulled, confused. He barked once, then again. The man didn't turn around, just walked away, boots crunching against the dead leaves, until he became a shape swallowed by the trees. Shadow waited. The first hour he stood, alert, expectant. By the second he sat. By the third he lay down. And by nightfall, something inside him had begun to break. The days that followed bled together. Hunger, cold. The rope grew heavier with every failed attempt to free himself. His bark, once trained and sharp, softened into a whisper. No one came. Until she did. The little human. Her scent was strange at first, flowers and peanut butter and something innocent. She moved like light, gently and without demand. She didn't shout. She didn't throw. She knelt and offered food. Shadow hadn't trusted her. Not at first. But hunger speaks louder than fear, and kindness, even when unfamiliar, finds its way into broken hearts like water into cracked stone. She came back the next day, and the next. She untied him, brought him into a tiny wooden home filled with warmth and quiet, and sat beside him. No leash, no command, just presence. And her hands, those hands. He would never forget the first time they touched him. Not with a jerk or a push, but with care. Tentative, yes. Nervous, maybe, but kind. They wiped his wounds, brushed his fur, let him rest his head against her lap. It was like feeling sunlight after a lifetime of shadow. She named him that, Shadow. And for the first time, he felt like a name was a gift. In the present, curled up on the blanket in her laundry room, Shadow stirred in his sleep. His paws twitched as the past played behind his eyes, but when Emily walked in, soft-footed, humming under her breath, he opened his eyes slowly, letting the memory fade like mist in morning light. She knelt beside him, placed her hand on his chest, and everything in him stilled. That hand, smaller than any he had known before, held no command, no control. Only comfort, only home. He leaned into her without hesitation, resting his head in her lap. The world could knock again. The past could scratch at the door. But right here, right now, he was not what he had been. He was not a number, not a tool, not forgotten. He was Shadow, and she had found him. The days that followed were restless, not loud or chaotic, but strained, like a violin string pulled too tight. The man had returned, just as he said he would, this time with a printed document in his hand and a lawyer who wore impatience like a second skin. He filed a formal claim with the town, asserting ownership over the dog, over Shadow. His tone was cold, his words carefully chosen, but his eyes still held that same emptiness. Shadow had looked at him only once and then turned his face away, as if he were erasing a memory he didn't want back. Emily listened from the hallway that day, clutching Shadow's collar in one hand as her mother spoke with their neighbor, who worked at the courthouse. He filed with the town clerk. Says he has legal right through the old microchip. If he pushes it, it could go to a hearing. And it did. Within a week, a formal date was set. A small town hearing at the municipal building, just 2 rooms and a coffee machine, but to Emily, it felt like a looming mountain. She had never been inside a courtroom. She didn't understand legal words. All she knew was that someone might take Shadow away, someone who had left him, hurt him, forgotten him, and now wanted him back simply because he could. Emily's mother acted fast. She called every animal advocacy contact she could find in the nearby towns. It was a stroke of luck, or something more, that led her to Mr. Louis Anders, a retired lawyer who had once specialized in animal welfare cases. He had kind eyes, wiry white hair, and a German shepherd of his own, long gone but still framed in a photo on his wall. When he came to visit, Shadow approached him with a measured calm, sniffed his hand, then settled by his feet as if choosing him too. That was all the lawyer needed to take the case. "The law can be muddy when it comes to animals," he told them gently, "but we'll do everything we can. A dog is not a possession, not when love's involved." Emily spent her evenings at the kitchen table with a pencil in hand and paper spread in front of her. At first, she tried to write a letter. Then it turned into notes. And finally, into something else entirely, a speech. She didn't use big words or formal phrases. Instead, she wrote the truth in a child's simple, aching honesty. About the day she heard him in the woods. About his ribs, his silence, his fear. About how he didn't bark, didn't beg, just breathed like someone trying not to vanish. And about how she, without meaning to, had changed the ending of his story. "He was alone," she wrote, "but I found him. And then he found me." The night before the hearing, Emily couldn't sleep. Shadow lay curled at the foot of her bed, eyes half closed but alert. Every few minutes, he looked up at her, as if sensing the storm that gathered around them. She reached down to stroke his fur, and he nuzzled closer, his head resting near her feet. "I'm scared," she whispered. He didn't move, but he stayed. The next morning was gray and overcast, the sky hanging low with the weight of a coming rain. The small town hall was already filled when they arrived. Neighbors, students from Emily's school, even Miss Adams from her classroom. Word had spread. Not just about the hearing, but about the story. The dog in the woods, the little girl who saved him, the stranger who wanted him back. The man sat on one side of the room, arms crossed, his lawyer flipping through papers. Emily sat beside Mr. Anders and her mother, Shadow lying calmly at her feet, his eyes scanning the room but never resting long on any one person. When it was time, the town clerk, a balding man with a gentle voice, called the room to attention. Each side was allowed to speak. The man's lawyer stood first, laying out the legal case. The microchip matched his name. The dog had gone missing. He had searched for him. It was all so neat, so clean on paper. Then Mr. Anders stood, speaking of neglect, of abandonment, of what Shadow's condition had been when Emily found him. He held up photographs, Shadow's matted fur, the rope burns, the rawness in his eyes. And finally, the clerk turned to Emily. She stood slowly, her paper shaking slightly in her hands. The room was quiet now, all eyes on her, but she didn't look at them. She looked at Shadow. "When I found him," she began, her voice small, "he didn't look like a dog anymore. He looked like a ghost, like someone who forgot what it meant to matter." She paused, her eyes wet but steady. "I didn't know what to do, so I sat with him. And he let me. He let me be near him. I gave him food and he gave me something back. Not right away, but slowly. He started trusting again. So did I." She took a deep breath. "I know you're all grown-ups, and you use big words and laws to decide what's right. But sometimes, right isn't written down. Sometimes you just know it." Her voice dropped into a whisper. "He saved me too." The room stayed quiet for a long time after she sat down. The clerk leaned forward, his eyes on Shadow, who now looked up at Emily with a calm that only comes from being truly seen. Then he turned to the man in the corner, the one whose name was on the chip but not, anymore, in the dog's heart. "The law gives weight to ownership," the clerk said softly, "but it also recognizes abandonment. And in this case, we don't just see a pet, we see a bond. His voice was quiet, but final. Shadow stays. There was no cheering, no clapping, just the sound of Emily exhaling, her arms wrapping around Shadow's neck as he leaned into her with the weight of someone finally allowed to stay. The battle was over, and love had won. There are moments in life that don't feel like moments at all. They feel like turning points, quiet earthquakes beneath our feet that shift the path ahead forever. For Emily, that moment arrived in a small wooden courtroom, where the walls smelled faintly of dust and the windows let in thin gray light from an overcast sky. Everything was still. Everyone was waiting. Shadow lay at her feet, calm and quiet, his eyes flicking gently between faces in the room. His body, once bruised and cautious, now rested with trust. He didn't growl. He didn't hide. He just waited as if he already knew what Emily was only daring to hope. The hearing had stretched longer than expected. There had been documents and counter-documents, statements and objections. The man, the one who had left Shadow behind like old trash, had sat with crossed arms and stiff eyes, barely reacting even when photos were presented of the rope burns, the open sores, the ribs poking through fur. But the words that moved the room weren't the legal ones. They came from the vet, who described in careful, steady tones the pain Shadow must have endured. From Mr. Anders, who spoke of how the law must protect not only property, but lives, especially ones that cannot speak for themselves. And most of all, they came from Emily, her soft voice still echoing through the courtroom like the flicker of a candle in the dark. He saved me too. Now it was the judge's turn. A woman in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled into a bun and reading glasses that sat low on her nose, she had listened intently all morning. She had not interrupted, not once. Her gaze had lingered longest on Shadow. And now, with her gavel resting like a question mark beside her hand, she looked over the room before speaking. "Animals," she began, her voice firm but full of depth, "are not things. They are not furniture to be discarded, nor tools to be used until worn. They feel. They suffer. And sometimes, when the world is lucky, they teach." She paused, eyes landing briefly on Emily. This dog, Shadow, was not lost. He was abandoned, left to die in silence. Had it not been for the actions of this child and her family, he would not be here today. The man shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The court finds sufficient evidence of willful neglect and abandonment," the judge continued. "Shadow will remain in the custody of the family who saved him. Further, Mr. Jameson is fined for violation of local animal cruelty laws and is barred from owning another dog for the next 5 years. A murmur passed through the room. Emily's mother let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Mr. Anders nodded quietly, lips pressed together in subtle victory. And Emily, she didn't cheer. She didn't leap from her chair. Instead, she leaned forward, and Shadow raised his head, as if waiting. Then she smiled, full and bright, and wrapped her arms around his neck. Shadow responded in the way only he could, by licking her face once, gently, right on the cheek. The room softened into quiet applause. Not wild, not loud, just warm, like a breeze through open windows after a storm has passed. Even the judge smiled. As they walked out of the courthouse, the first drops of rain began to fall, light and cool against the pavement, not enough to run from, just enough to feel. Emily held Shadow's leash in one hand, though he didn't need it. He stayed close, walking beside her with quiet dignity, like someone returning home not just to a house, but to his place in the world. They didn't speak much on the ride back. Words felt unnecessary. Back at the little house on the edge of town, Shadow stepped onto the porch like he had always belonged there, like he knew now, deep in his bones, that no one could take him away again. Emily opened the door and let him inside. He trotted gently into the living room, turned twice on his blanket, and curled into a soft, contented circle. He had come full circle, from silence and pain to warmth and belonging. And now, he was not just staying. He was home. In the weeks that followed the courtroom decision, life in Meadowbrook began to shift. Not dramatically, not in the kind of way that makes headlines in big cities, but in a way that whispered through backyards, coffee shops, and kitchen tables. It was subtle, like sunlight finding its way into a room that had long been shut. And at the heart of it all was a girl, a dog, and the bond that had turned a forgotten animal into a town's quiet hero. Emily didn't think of herself as anything special. She still woke up early to feed Shadow, still sat cross-legged on the living room floor with her sketchpad, and still walked the same path to school each morning with a backpack slightly too big for her shoulders. But others began to see her differently. More than a girl who saved a dog, she had become something else. A reminder that one act of compassion could ripple far beyond its first intention. Shadow, too, had changed. The once thin, silent dog now walked with quiet pride. His fur had thickened, his frame had filled out, and though he still flinched at sharp sounds from time to time, there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. When he walked through town with Emily, people noticed. They smiled, waved, sometimes crossed the street just to meet him. He had become a story that people wanted to be part of. A symbol of survival, yes, but more than that, a symbol of what was possible when someone chose to care. One day, after school, Emily sat with her mother at the kitchen table, watching Shadow nap by the window, his head resting against the sill where the afternoon light spilled in. She turned to her mom and asked, "Do you think there are other shadows out there?" Her mother set her teacup down gently. "I think there are too many." Emily nodded, the thought settling into her heart like a quiet truth. Then maybe we should help them too. It began simply. Emily and her mom visited Dr. Rowan's clinic the next day and asked if they could volunteer. At first, it was small tasks, refilling water bowls, folding towels, organizing pet food. But Emily didn't stop there. She made posters with Shadow's face on them and wrote at the bottom in big letters, "Help us help more like him." People noticed. Soon, old blankets started showing up at the clinic's doorstep. Bags of kibble. Handwritten notes with small donations. Children dropped off toys their own dogs had outgrown. Shadow's name was whispered in barbershops and bake sales. His story passed through the town like a gentle wave, waking people up to a need they hadn't seen or hadn't wanted to see. One afternoon, a shiny black car pulled up in front of Emily's house. A tall woman in a green coat stepped out, her hair pinned neatly and a clipboard in hand. She introduced herself as the mayor's assistant. "The mayor would like to meet Emily," she said with a warm smile. "And Shadow, of course." Emily blinked in surprise, then called out, "Shadow, we have company." Shadow trotted to the door, tail wagging gently, his head tilting in that curious way he had when new people arrived. The mayor came the next day, not with a podium or a speech, but with a notebook and genuine interest. She sat on their porch, speaking with Emily and her mom over lemonade, asking questions about what it had been like to find Shadow, to fight for him, to heal him. Shadow lay beside Emily, his eyes half closed, basking in the sun. "This town could use more stories like this," the mayor said at last, scribbling something in her notebook. "More people who listen with their hearts first." That same week, the local newspaper published a feature story titled, "The Girl Who Listened." Beneath the headline was a photo, Emily sitting cross-legged in the grass, Shadow's head resting in her lap. Her hair was windswept, her eyes calm, and her hand rested gently on the dog who had once been no one's. The article told of their journey, the rescue, the recovery, the courtroom, and the movement growing in its quiet wake. Letters began arriving, not just from within Meadowbrook, but from nearby towns. People who had read the story, who had their own shadows, who had been waiting for a sign that someone still cared. One woman wrote, "My daughter's afraid of dogs. After your story, we're visiting the shelter next week." A boy from another school sent a drawing of a dog with wings. He wrote beneath it, "Shadow is a guardian now." Emily taped each letter to her bedroom wall. They weren't just messages. They were proof. Proof that love, when given freely, could echo. Shadow, once hidden in the woods and left behind without a name, had become more than a pet. He had become a symbol, not of tragedy, but of second chances, of listening when no one else will, of reaching out even when it's easier to walk away. And Emily, she was no longer just the girl who found him. She was the girl who reminded a town what it meant to care. The barn had been empty for years. Tucked behind the trees at the back of Emily's property, it stood like an old memory, its paint peeled, its doors weathered, and dust clinging to the beams like forgotten dreams. It had once been full of life. Chickens, a goat or two, even a horse when Emily's grandfather was still alive. But those days were long past. The world had moved on, and the barn had been left behind. Until now. It was Emily's idea to bring it back. The inspiration had grown quietly inside her, planted the day she saw her story in the local paper, and watered every time someone wrote in or dropped by the vet clinic to ask, "Is there a way we can help too?" There was. And it began with the barn. They called it Hope House, a name that came to Emily as naturally as breathing. It felt right. Simple, strong, like the kind of name a place needed when it would be built on broken things finding a new purpose. The entire town, it seemed, had something to give. Mr. Green from the hardware store donated paint. Miss Lila from the cafe brought in crates of old towels and blankets. A retired carpenter fixed the fence and built a new sign that hung proudly above the barn doors. Hope House, a place to heal. Inside, they cleaned and scrubbed and swept away years of dust and cobwebs. Emily and her mother laid down soft bedding in corners of the barn and set up crates for dogs too shy to sleep out in the open. They hung lights from the rafters, strung with soft bulbs that gave the space a golden glow when the sun went down. And through it all, Shadow watched. He walked from corner to corner, sniffing the floorboards, circling each new bed like a watchful guardian. He knew. Somehow, he knew what this was. He could feel it in the way Emily moved through the space. Calm, careful, filled with purpose. This wasn't just a barn anymore. It was a second chance. The first dogs arrived slowly. A mutt left at a gas station. A shy spaniel whose owner had passed. A pair of siblings found under a porch. Each one came carrying the weight of silence, and each one found a place inside Hope House to lay that weight down. Emily was there every day. After school, before dinner, on weekends, brushing fur, filling water bowls, offering quiet company to animals who weren't ready yet for anything else. But at night, when the barn settled into stillness, it was always Shadow she read to. They had their spot, a blanket near the eastern wall, where the moonlight slipped in through a narrow window. Emily would bring a book, sometimes a new one, sometimes an old favorite, and lie beside Shadow with her feet tucked under a pillow. She read softly, her voice a gentle hum in the quiet. She didn't care if the stories were meant for children or grown-ups. To Shadow, all that mattered was the sound. Other children began to come too. At first, just one or two, friends from school who had heard about Shadow and wanted to see the hero dog. But what they found in the barn was more than just a dog. They found comfort, safety, a quiet that wrapped around them like a warm coat. Some came because they loved animals. Others came because they needed to feel loved themselves. There was Lily, who had lost her father the year before and hadn't smiled in months, until Shadow rested his head in her lap and stayed there without moving for nearly an hour. There was Mateo, who struggled with reading but would practice every word slowly, leaning against the side of Shadow's body, finding confidence in every wag of that steady tail. And there was Jonah, who never spoke much but came every week just to sit quietly on the barn steps and listen to the wind move through the rafters while Shadow sat beside him, saying nothing but somehow saying everything. Shadow, once abandoned and silent, had become something none of them expected. He had become hope itself. Emily sometimes sat back and watched him move through the barn, how he would greet each new arrival with calm patience, how he seemed to know exactly when to step closer and when to simply lie nearby. He had no training for this, no title, and yet he had become a healer, a listener, a steady breath in a world that often moved too fast for broken hearts. At night, when the barn emptied and the animals slept, Emily would close the doors, tuck her book under her arm, and whisper to Shadow, "We helped today, didn't we?" And he would look at her with eyes full of things beyond words. You did. Hope House had begun as a rescue, a place for animals to find safety. But now it was more. It was a place for anyone, two-legged or four, who had ever felt lost, unwanted, or unseen. And it all started with one dog tied to a tree and one girl who stopped to listen. Winter had settled quietly over Meadowbrook, the kind of winter that softened the world into white silence. Rooftops blanketed in snow, trees dressed in frost, and streets echoing with the crunch of boots. The pond near the edge of the park had frozen solid, its surface shimmering like glass under the gray winter sky. Children came with sleds and scarves, testing the ice with laughter and bright mittens. Parents stood nearby, coffee in hand, calling out gentle warnings, "Not too far. Stay near the edge." It was peaceful, but stillness can be deceiving. Shadow walked beside Emily that afternoon, his paws leaving clean prints in the snow beside her boots. They had just finished reading at Hope House and decided to stop by the park before heading home. Emily's cheeks were pink with cold, her breath rising in little clouds, and Shadow, though older now, moved with purpose, his eyes sharp, his steps steady. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint, so easily lost beneath the wind, that Emily missed it entirely. But Shadow didn't. Then a splash. A muffled cry, small, desperate, fading. Shadow stopped. His ears perked. His body stiffened. And then he ran. It happened so quickly that Emily barely had time to react. One moment he was at her side. The next he was tearing across the snow, barking loud and sharp, his voice ringing through the quiet like an alarm. "Shadow!" Emily shouted, running after him. "What is it?" He didn't look back. People turned their heads. A few parents called out, startled by the sudden barking. But Shadow was already near the pond, skidding to a stop near the far side, his bark becoming more frantic, more urgent. And then Emily saw it, a hole in the ice, and someone, struggling in the freezing water. A boy, no more than 7 or 8. His arms flailed, his voice weak. He was slipping beneath the surface, pulled by the weight of soaked clothes and the biting cold. Shadow barked again, pacing at the edge of the pond, tail stiff, muscles taut. He didn't try to go in. He was smart enough to know his limits, but he would not stop making noise. His voice cut through panic. It demanded to be heard. And someone heard. 2 men sprinted across the snow, followed by a woman dialing 911 with shaking hands. A rope was thrown, a ladder stretched across the ice. Within minutes, though it felt like a lifetime, strong arms pulled the boy from the freezing water and wrapped him in blankets. He was alive. Emily reached Shadow just as the crowd gathered. She dropped to her knees, arms flung around his neck, tears frozen on her lashes. "You saw him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No one else did. You saw him." Shadow leaned into her, his breath warm against her cheek, his heart beating steadily beneath her hands. Around them, people stared. Some clapped. Some simply watched in awe. An older man knelt beside them. "That dog," he said, eyes wide, "he saved that boy's life." Emily looked up, her voice breaking through a sob. "He's not just mine," she whispered, pressing her forehead against Shadow's fur. "He's everyone's." And in that moment, everyone knew it was true. Shadow, once discarded, once left to die, had not only been saved, he had become a savior. News of what happened spread through town like a spark catching dry leaves. The boy recovered, the pond was fenced off, and Shadow's name was once again on every tongue. But this time, it wasn't just about rescue or healing. It was about heroism, courage, a reminder that sometimes the ones we save end up saving others. Later that night, back at home, Emily sat beside Shadow by the fireplace. The flames flickered softly, casting golden light on the walls. She held a mug of cocoa in one hand, her other resting on Shadow's shoulder. "You knew," she said quietly. "You heard what no one else did." Shadow didn't respond, of course. He simply lay his head in her lap, eyes closing, content. But Emily smiled, because she didn't need words to understand what he had done. Shadow had been watching over the world, just as she had once watched over him. And he would keep watching. Boys. The town square had never felt so full. Not loud, not bustling, just full. Full of warmth, of quiet smiles, of boots shifting in the winter snow and scarves pulled up to flushed cheeks. The trees were wrapped in string lights, casting soft halos over the gathered crowd. Children stood shoulder to shoulder with grandparents, teachers with farmers, cafe owners with school kids, all drawn here by one story, one dog, and one little girl who had loved him enough to listen. A small stage had been built near the gazebo. At the center stood a wooden podium decorated with pine boughs, and behind it, a tall woman in a green coat stepped forward, the mayor. Her voice rang through a microphone that crackled slightly in the cold air. "Meadowbrook has always been a quiet town," she said. "But quiet doesn't mean small. Sometimes, the biggest stories happen in the smallest places. And sometimes, heroes don't wear uniforms or make speeches. They simply walk beside us, silently, and change everything." There was a murmur of agreement. All eyes turned toward the stage steps, where Emily stood, holding Shadow's leash loosely in one hand, a folded sheet of paper in the other. Beside her, Shadow stood tall, his winter-thick coat gleaming in the soft light, his eyes alert but calm. When the mayor called his name, "Shadow, today we honor you," the crowd broke into gentle applause. A local officer stepped forward, carrying a small medal attached to a leather strap. It wasn't official, not government-issued or military standard. But it was real, real in meaning, in love. A silver disc engraved with a single line. "For bravery and heart, Meadowbrook's own." He bent slightly and gently placed it around Shadow's neck. Shadow didn't flinch. He stood still, his tail moving slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd, not with pride, but with the deep, steady presence of someone who understood that this wasn't about him, not really. It was about what love could do when given a second chance. Then came Emily's turn. She climbed the short steps, her boots crunching softly against the snow-dusted wood. She stood behind the podium, hands shaking just slightly, her speech trembling in her fingers. But when she looked up and saw the crowd, and then looked down at Shadow, who had followed and now sat by her feet, she took a deep breath and began. "When I first found Shadow, he didn't bark. He didn't beg. He didn't even move. He was like a shadow, really quiet, still, barely there. He had been left behind by the world. But somehow, even though he had every reason to hide, he stayed. He let me sit beside him. And little by little, we helped each other heal." She paused, glancing down. Shadow looked up at her, calm and steady, like always. He saved lives, Emily continued, her voice clearer now. Not with strength, not with teeth or speed. He saved lives with his heart. He listened when no one else did. He saw what others missed. He gave people hope, not just me, not just that boy on the pond, but this whole town. She smiled then, a soft curve of her lips that seemed to shine brighter than the lights behind her. He didn't ask to be a hero. He just became one, because he never gave up. There was a moment of silence when she finished. And then the applause began, slow at first, then building into something that wrapped the stage in warmth. Not thunderous, not chaotic, just full. Like the town itself had leaned forward and said, "Thank you." Emily stepped away from the podium and sat on the edge of the stage, right there in her snow-dusted coat, and Shadow came to her instantly. Without hesitation, he lay beside her, his head resting gently in her lap. The metal around his neck caught the light. And for a long, quiet moment, the town simply watched. Not a performance, not a spectacle, just a girl and her dog, no longer a shadow of the past, but a beacon of what was possible when love met pain and chose to stay. Time didn't ask permission. It never does. It simply moves, soft as a breeze, sure as sunrise, quietly threading itself through days and nights, until you look back and wonder when it all changed. Emily had grown taller. Her shoes sat side by side with her mother's now. Her voice had deepened slightly, her laugh had stretched into something older, and the sketchbooks on her desk had grown thicker, fuller. She was a teenager now, not quite a child, not yet an adult, standing at that delicate edge between who she was and who she would become. And Shadow was changing too. His steps were slower now, more thoughtful than before. His once dark muzzle had begun to gray like frost on a winter morning, and when he stood up from his favorite blanket in the living room, he did so with a soft groan, as if each movement had become a conversation with age. But his eyes, those warm, steady eyes, never changed. They held the same fire, the same quiet knowing, the same unwavering presence that had always been there. Everywhere Emily went, Shadow followed. Maybe not as quickly as he used to, maybe not bounding like a puppy, but he came, always. If she walked out into the yard at dusk to feel the breeze, he'd be there, settling beside her in the grass. If she sat on the porch with a book and a cup of tea, he'd rest his chin on her foot like he used to as a pup. They didn't need to speak. They never had. Some days, Emily would pause mid-step, glance down at him, and think he's getting older. And other days, she would shake the thought away like dust from her coat. Because he was still hers. And she was still his. In the golden quiet of evening, they'd walk to Hope House, now expanded, painted new each year, always filled with stories. Shadow didn't run with the other dogs anymore. He let the young ones tumble past him in the snow, bark loud, and tug at ropes. He'd sit beneath the tree near the fence and watch, as if passing on the torch, letting others do the dancing while he kept the rhythm steady from the shade. Children still came. They still asked, "Is that the real Shadow?" And Emily still smiled and said, "Yes, but he's not just mine. He's everyone's." In their home, there were framed photos on the wall, one from the medal ceremony, one from the frozen pond, and one Emily had taken herself. A close-up of Shadow's face, his eyes half closed, her reflection caught faintly in them. She called it the moment between. It won a ribbon at a local art show. Evenings became their time, no longer filled with storybooks and whispered words, but with the kind of silence that only two souls who have walked through fire together can share. She would sit cross-legged on the floor, scrolling through her sketchpad or flipping pages in a journal, and Shadow would lie beside her, his breathing steady, his body warm. And when she looked at him, really looked, she saw more than just a dog. She saw years. She saw the rope on the tree, the first wag of a tail, the courtrooms, the barn, the pond, the children, the healing. She saw the entire story stitched into his fur like threads of memory, woven so tightly into her life that there was no separating where she ended and he began. They had grown together, in the deepest sense of the word. She had gone from a quiet little girl with too much time and too many questions, to a young woman who now walked with purpose, shaped by the kind of love that doesn't flash or fade, the kind that stays. And Shadow? Shadow had gone from forgotten to unforgettable. Sometimes, Emily would lie on the floor beside him, forehead pressed against his, and whisper, "You're still my best friend." He would blink slowly, sometimes sigh. And that was enough. Because no matter how many winters passed, how many springs melted the frost, how many birthdays came and went, one thing never changed. They were still walking the road together, side by side, heart to heart. The morning arrived slowly, wrapped in a gray sky and the soft hum of rain tapping gently against the windows. The house was quiet, more than usual. It wasn't the usual peaceful kind of silence. It was heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Emily woke with a familiar rhythm. She stretched, pulled her blanket aside, and called softly into the stillness of the hallway, "Shadow, breakfast." She waited. No sound. No soft tapping of paws on the hardwood floor. No tail thumping. No familiar shuffle of an old dog rising slowly to greet the day. Her voice caught. She called again, quieter this time, already knowing. Still, her heart clung to hope as she stepped into the hallway barefoot, her chest tightening with every silent step toward the spot near the kitchen window where Shadow always slept. There he was, curled gently on his blanket, his body perfectly still, his head resting on the soft part of the fabric he had claimed as his own. For a moment, Emily thought he might still be asleep, just dreaming like he always did, chasing something joyful behind closed eyes. But the stillness was too deep. His chest did not rise. His ears didn't twitch. And when she whispered his name, he didn't move. She dropped to her knees beside him and placed her hand gently on his side. He was still warm, as if his spirit had only just left a few moments ago, as if the night had quietly closed a chapter without waking anyone. Emily didn't cry at first. She sat there in the silence, her hands buried in his fur, her forehead resting against his, breathing in the last of him. Then, slowly, the tears came, quiet, not loud, as though even her grief was trying not to disturb him. The ache inside her was unlike anything she had ever known. It didn't roar. It hollowed. She whispered through her tears, "You were supposed to stay just a little longer." It began raining harder by noon, as if the sky itself had heard the news. The soft drizzle soaked the backyard and turned the wind into a song of goodbye. Emily's mother wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her in the kitchen doorway. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Word spread through the town before they had even thought to call anyone. And slowly, people came, some with umbrellas, others with nothing but their hearts open and heavy. They brought flowers, handwritten notes, and drawings. Children came with pages pulled from sketchbooks, Shadow with wings, Shadow resting on clouds, Shadow waiting at a gate made of stars. The question came quietly, asked in a hush by Emily's mother, "Where would you like him to rest?" Emily didn't hesitate. Through her tears, she whispered, "The oak tree." It was the only place that felt right. The same tree in the woods where she had found him, where he had waited, starving and broken, but still full of quiet hope. It was where their story had started, and now it would be where it was gently laid to rest. The walk to the tree was slow. A handful of close friends helped carry Shadow, wrapped in his favorite blanket, the one Emily had stitched his name into years ago. The trail through the woods was damp and lined with fallen leaves, their edges curling like paper burned at the tips. The oak stood tall and strong, branches stretched wide as if still guarding the memory of that first meeting long ago. A small grave had been dug already. Some boys from town had come early to help. Inside, someone had placed a smooth, flat stone. Emily knelt beside it and placed his worn collar down into the earth. She took a breath and closed her eyes. Her fingers brushed the fur one last time. Then she whispered, "You were my first real friend. My always." A quiet sob escaped her lips. Around her, the townspeople stood in silence. Some wept openly. Others pressed their hands to their hearts. One by one, they each took a turn gently placing earth back over him. Not in a rush, not with force, but with care. Emily stood with her mother, watching the blanket disappear beneath the soil, until all that was left was the small, fresh mound beneath the branches of the tree that had once seen Shadow's worst day, and now stood watch over his peace. When it was done, Emily placed something special on the grave, a drawing she had made not long ago. It showed Shadow running freely through tall grass beneath a bright, endless sky. No leash, no scars, no pain. Just joy. That evening, Emily sat alone on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, her tea gone cold beside her. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the clouds began to lift. The trees were dark with moisture, their trunks shimmering with memory. In the quiet, she spoke, not aloud, not even with her lips, but inside herself, deep where grief meets love. "You were my story," she whispered. "You were the one who taught me how to see the invisible, how to hear what others ignored. You weren't just my dog. You were my heart." She looked toward the woods. The oak stood there still, half covered in mist, and she imagined him there, just out of sight. Not gone. Just waiting. Just resting. And in that sacred silence, Emily knew this wasn't truly the end, because Shadow had not vanished. He had become part of the soil beneath her feet, the roots of the tree that once gave him shade, the stars that would shine a little brighter over Hope House from now on. Love like that doesn't end. It echoes. Forever. Years passed gently, the way they do in small towns that still sleep under quiet skies and wake with the sound of birdsong and soft wind through trees. Meadowbrook had changed, yes. New homes, a few wider roads, a cafe that stayed open past dusk, but some things had only deepened with time. And at the edge of town, tucked behind a white fence lined with blooming dogwood trees, stood a place now known far beyond Meadowbrook's borders, Hope House. The barn where it all began was still there, weathered, proud, and full of life. But the shelter had grown, its heart stitched with memory and love. Wooden additions had been built, then repainted every year by volunteers. Each room had a name: trust room, healing room, the run, the reading corner. And at the center of the entry path stood a bronze statue, not large or grand, but just right, of a German shepherd sitting upright, head tilted slightly, ears perked. His eyes were full of attention, carved carefully to capture that signature look of alert gentleness. On the base of the statue were just 5 words. Shadow, the dog who stayed. Visitors came often now. Some brought strays. Some brought donations. Some brought stories, folded gently into memory, of pets they'd lost, hearts they were healing, wounds they hadn't known they carried. And standing there to greet them, clipboard in hand, was a young woman with wind in her hair and calm in her voice. Emily. She was 20 now. Not the child who once wandered through woods with a sandwich in her pocket and a heart full of wonder, but not someone else, either. She had grown into herself like trees grow into their roots, slow, steady, unshakable. Her jeans were often muddy. Her hands carried calluses and ink stains from notes and sketches. And her smile, that had never changed. Emily ran Hope House full-time now. The role had never been formally given. She had simply stepped into it one morning after graduation and never stepped out. It was hers, not just the title, but the purpose, the calling. She kept her father's old radio in the back office and still used the same mug from her school years. Dog hair is my glitter. Most mornings started with coffee, a list of new arrivals, and a quiet moment by the oak tree. Shadow's grave, now surrounded by native flowers and a small wooden bench, had become a sacred spot. Every staff member, every volunteer, every rescued animal had passed it at some point, some pausing, some sitting, some whispering. Emily visited it daily. Sometimes she spoke. Sometimes she just stood there, listening to the wind, like she had so many years ago when she heard that first broken bark in the woods. New dogs arrived almost every week, frightened, hungry, unsure. But Emily had a way of calming them. She didn't rush. She didn't crowd. She simply knelt, waited, and whispered, "It's okay." The same words she had once spoken to a dog tied to a tree. It had become a ritual, not a performance, not a copy, but a remembering, a sacred echo. And every rescue, every new life that found its way to Hope House, began the same way, with a story. Once, Emily would say, sometimes to a nervous child, sometimes to a tired parent holding a trembling puppy, a little girl found a broken dog tied to a tree. They would lean in quiet, listening. He didn't bark. He didn't cry. He just watched. And she sat beside him and waited. She didn't save him in one day. She just stayed. And slowly, they healed together. She didn't tell the whole story every time, but she always made sure that people knew this place hadn't come from funding or fame or chance. It had come from love, the simple, steady kind, the kind that notices, the kind that kneels, the kind that stays. Photos of Shadow lined the shelter walls, not in a shrine-like way, but as reminders. One showed him curled on the blanket in Emily's childhood home. Another showed the town ceremony, his medal shining beneath the stage lights. And in the front lobby was Emily's favorite, a picture of Shadow sitting beneath the oak tree, eyes half closed, breeze brushing through his fur. Peaceful. Children still came to read. Teenagers volunteered during summers. Vets from nearby counties asked Emily for help placing hard-to-adopt dogs. And every holiday season, donations overflowed, not because of marketing, but because of memory. Because Shadow was never forgotten. Neither was Emily. In quiet moments, when the shelter was calm and the sun had begun to lower behind the fields, Emily would sit by the statue and rest her hand on the bronze paw. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and imagine it warm again, not metal, but fur. Not still, but breathing. She didn't cry much anymore. She didn't need to. Grief had long since settled into something softer, not gone, but part of her. Like a scar that doesn't hurt anymore but still tells you where you've been. Shadow had passed years ago, but his bark still echoed, not in sound but in action. Every door opened for a frightened animal. Every hand extended gently. Every child who sat beside a shivering pup and whispered, "You're safe." That was the legacy of a bark. And as long as Hope House stood, as long as there were hearts willing to listen, that legacy would never fade. The letter had no fancy heading. Just paper, slightly yellowed at the edges, folded carefully inside a plain white envelope marked with simple handwriting, "To anyone who has ever listened." It sat on the welcome desk at Hope House, beside a jar of treats and a framed photo of a German shepherd with wise eyes and a knowing tilt of the head. Most visitors picked it up without knowing why. Something about it just invited attention. And as they unfolded the paper and began to read, the room around them seemed to grow quieter, as though even the walls wanted to listen. "My name is Emily," it began. "You may know me as the girl who found Shadow. Or maybe you don't know me at all. Maybe today is your first time at Hope House. Maybe you're here with a trembling dog or a tired heart. Maybe both. If so, I want to share something with you. Not a rule book or a history, just a story. My story. Shadow's story. Our story. What followed wasn't grand or poetic, but it was honest, and that made it powerful. She spoke of the day everything changed, when she was just a little girl wandering through the edge of the woods. She remembered the wind through the trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and that strange, broken sound she couldn't quite place. Not a bark, not a cry. Something in between. She had followed it, heart pounding, knees shaking, not because she was brave, but because something deep inside her whispered, "Someone needs you." And there he was. A dog tied to a tree, starving, silent, still. He didn't move when she approached, didn't growl, didn't beg. He just watched her. And she, a quiet 6-year-old with a peanut butter sandwich in her pocket and a heart wide open, sat down beside him and said, "It's okay." "He saved me," the letter said, long before I understood what that meant. Emily wrote not just about the dog, but what came after, how her life expanded around him. The shelter, the court case, the healing, how the town learned to care again. How trust rebuilt itself, slowly, like moss growing back on a broken stone. How Shadow, once forgotten, became a symbol, not because he was loud, but because he was steady. Not because he fought, but because he stayed. As the letter continued, it unfolded like a memory woven gently through time. Emily talked about their nights together, her reading aloud, Shadow listening, their lives stitched quietly into routine. About the way he welcomed every new rescue as if telling them, "I've been where you are too." She wrote about the children who sat beside him, the grown-ups who softened in his presence, the way his calmness gave others permission to hope again. Then came the harder part, the day the house was too quiet, the morning when he didn't come to the door, the walk down the hallway, the weight in her chest. She described how she found him on his blanket by the window, curled as if asleep, but already gone. And how the rain had begun just hours later, soft and steady, like even the sky had paused to say goodbye. "They say grief fades," she wrote, "but I think it just changes its shape. It becomes part of your breath, part of the way you look at the world. I miss him every single day. But I carry him with me in every story I hear, every dog I kneel beside, every new life that walks through these shelter doors." Shadow may have passed, but he never left. She described Hope House as more than a shelter. It was a promise, a memory turned into action, a place where every rescue begins not with cages and forms, but with presence, with someone willing to sit beside a frightened animal and wait, with someone brave enough to listen. And finally, near the bottom of the page, came her closing words, the ones that always made people stop and look out the nearest window, as if hoping to see something familiar hiding in the trees. "If you ever hear a cry in the woods, not a bark, not a scream, but something in between, I hope you stop. I hope you listen, because sometimes what you find tied to a tree isn't just a dog. It's your story waiting to begin. That's how I found Shadow. Or maybe that's how he found me." No signature, just space, just stillness. Visitors often set the letter down in silence. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they smiled. Sometimes they walked outside and simply stood by the statue of Shadow, the one that watched over the entrance like a silent sentinel of second chances. Hope House continued year after year, not because of donations or designs, but because of that letter, that story, that girl who listened, and the dog who stayed. Life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes, connections form in ways we don't understand. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible journeys. Until next time, stay curious and keep believing.